Hello, my name is Jonathan Stalling, and I'm the Newman Chair for U.S.-China Issues here at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the 2021 Newman Prize for Chinese Literature Symposium. The Newman Prize Symposium is the first of two events. Tomorrow night we'll hold the awards ceremony at the same time, so please do come to both. But before we get started this evening, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the heinous hate crimes that perpetrated on Asian Americans this week. And while it's certainly not the most horrible in our whole history, it is in the most horrible in recent history. And the increase of acts of anti-Asian hate crime over the last year and months is alarming and wholly unacceptable. Of course, our thoughts and prayers go out to the families of those who have lost loved ones and friends, and to the millions of Asian Americans and Asian diasporics people across the globe who have so long endured hate speech, hate crimes, and disenfranchisement stemming from systemic prejudice, racism, and the like. Those of us who work in cross-cultural humanities have a monumental task ahead of us, as do all Americans. While the task ahead must include deep structural work of ideology critique, historical analysis, and cultural contextualization, perhaps the deepest work of all will always be that which starts at home, in one's workplace, in the classroom, and every other facet of our personal, political, and public lives. I hope we can all stand in solidarity as we pursue justice, equity, inclusivity, and above all, safety from harm and from fear. But it is good to be with you among friends this evening, here celebrating the work of one of the greatest living authors in China, the novelist Lianke. So my colleague I'll introduce in a moment, Zhu Ping, will be hosting this evening's event, and we'll introduce our panelists in kind. But before we do, I'd just like to take a moment to mourn with you all that you're not here in person. This is always one of the best times to be at OU. For Chinese literature has a deep root system on our campus, and I would, normally we would be hosting this in the Chinese Literature Translation Archive, where we have had salons in the past. There we have the work of Howard Goldblatt, Arthur Whaley, Wolfgang Kubin, Wilem Yip, and now Brian Halton, among others. This work constitutes the draft material, the correspondence of their careers, and many personal libraries as well, so that when one comes to OU, you make sure to take a day or two so that you can peruse the collection and get a sense of the whole story of Chinese literature in English and German as well. Rather than just the final products of books, we can look at the minutiae that takes place, the real blood that flows through the veins of world literature. So among, of course, this, we would also meet our students and our staff. And so we welcome you here to the University of Oklahoma, and we hope that you will come in future Newman Prize symposiums and celebrations. I'd like to take just a moment to thank my dean, Scott Fritzen, who's here, for the College of International Studies, my department, and the Institute of U.S.-China Issues, which was founded with an endowment from the very generous endowment from Harold Newman and Ruth Newman, who I hope are here this evening joining us. This has always been a special time of year for all of us because they come to Oklahoma as well and get to meet all of you, the scholars who work in this field, and of course our winning authors. So thanks to both of you and to all of you for coming, and of course, especially to our esteemed panelists who join us quite literally from all over the globe this evening. So without further ado, I please like to introduce my colleague and friend, Zhu Ping, the acting editor-in-chief of Chinese Literature Today, and a dear friend. Zhu Ping.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the opening remark. And tonight we are honored to have 4 speakers to celebrate the 7th Newman laureate Yan Lianke. And the first one is Howard Choi, assistant professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. He is the author of Remapping the Past, Fictions of History in Deng's China, 1979 to 1997, the editor of Discourses of Disease, Writing Illness, the Mind and the Body in Modern China, and the assistant author of the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Confucianism. Currently, he is co-editing a volume, Routledge Companion to Yan Lianke, and the title of his talk is In the Dark Tradition, Yan Lianke's The Day the Sun Died. Howard.
Okay, thank you very much, Zhu Ping. Thank you for your invitation. I'm so glad to be able to have the chance to work with my colleagues again, Shirley, Carols, and some new friends here. Today, my talk, the title is In a Dark Tradition, Yanlianke's The Day the Sun Died, 日西 in Chinese. And the first part of my presentation today, we'll be talking about the dark tradition, and then I will focus on this novel by Yanlianke. And so here we go. For the dark tradition, I would like to start with, everybody knows, sorry, I had some technical problem, but I'll come back very soon to that. Okay, yeah. So I start with Liang Qichao. His call for revolution of the fiction, 小说界革命, in his very famous essay, 论小说与群之关系, written in 1902, 2 years after the failure of the constitutional movement. In this essay, Liang Qichao calls for to eliminate the thoughts of demons, shamans, foxes, and ghosts. So this is something he said that for his idea for a new fiction, and these elements should be eliminated from the new world. And I'll jump to later. However, there's another opinion about that is from Xia Jian. In his book, there's a chapter devoted to the power of darkness, 黑暗力量, on Lu Xun. Xia Jian said that Lu Xun no doubt carries some ghosts on his back, but they are not so hateful as his polemic essays suggest. For some of them, he could even harbor a secret love. Xia Jian finds out that Lu Xun actually, to some extent, he loves to talk about ghosts related to his childhood. And then he said, actually, comparatively, Lu Xun's later essays are not as lovely as his other essays talking about the ghosts and the spirits. And then we know that Xia Jian was a mentor of Liu Li. And Liu Li picked this up. And in what he suggests early in his study of Lu Xun, he was talking about counter traditions. Liu Li refuses to use the word anti-traditionalism because he thinks that it's not simply anti-tradition. So he invented the term counter-traditions, 抗传统. But then later in his lectures in Hong Kong, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, 2016, he published his collection of essays in which he added one tradition, that is the dark tradition, 幽传统. I will come to the term 幽 very soon. He describes this dark tradition as a minor tradition in Lu Xun and actually in Chinese literature too. And in which he says that if we get rid of all those ghosts, and there will be no art in Lu Xun's work. Of course, he goes back and he reminds us about Lu Xun's history of Chinese fiction. And then later in the new tradition, in the new edition of his Voices from the Iron House, Liu Li also points out the 幽灵面, a spiritual aspect, 鬼气, ghostly aura, in the Chinese cultural tradition. And then other terms he also used during an interview of him. He used the terms in addition to 幽灵, spirit. He also used 幽魂, specter, and 幽光, dim light. So this is the book I just quote from Liu Li, and in which he also points out that actually in the May 4th Enlightenment movement, he reminds us that the light in the Enlightenment and darkness actually are the two sides of the same tradition. So here, as I promised, I'm going to analyze the character Chinese character Yo a little bit. Yo, if you look at it in modern Chinese script, it looks like the outer part looks like a mountain, but it's actually a kind of a mistake in the change of, we call it Li Bian during the Han Dynasty. They changed the shape of some Chinese characters. So if you look at the right-hand side of the oracle bone inscriptions, you'll find different variants of the yo. And on the top of that, now it's clearer that it's like two grabs of silk. That means a small. And then at the bottom, instead of a mountain, we see the oracle inscription of fire. So it means it's a tiny fire. So it's described as 火威 by Ma Zhiren. Ma Zhiren was one of the most famous etymologists during the Republican period. So now we know that in what Liao Fan described as a Yo tradition, there is a little bit of light. So I actually personally I had a chance to discuss with Liao Li whether we should translate as a dim tradition or dark tradition. But the dim tradition sounds a little bit strange. So I keep the translation as the dark tradition. And in fact, in the most recent book by David Wong, Matters in Contemporary China, he devoted a chapter title to the idea of the beam of darkness, fiction as trans-illumination. And of course, trans-illumination has the part illumination that reminds us of what I mean, which I will also make a quote again later. So finally, let's focus on our protagonist today, Lianke. Everybody knows that Lianke has an idea, a literary concept, which is known as 神识主义, Mytho-Realism. And this is the most famous quote about his own definition of 神识主义. And this is a translation by Song Weijie. And here I quote, imaginations, metaphors, myths, legends, dreams, fantasy, demonization, and transplantation. These 6 elements are born from everyday life and social reality can all serve as mytho-realist methods and channels. So he described his own idea of mytho-realism as containing all these elements from imagination to demonization. The picture was taken at a reception of him in California and Michael Berry's house. And another famous quote from Lianke is his speech at the Kafka Prize Award ceremony. And that was in the year of 2014. The title of that speech was, I am selected by heaven and life to experience a darkness. So I highlighted experience darkness. In this speech, he talked about a blind man from his village. And a blind man during the day, because of his blindness, he would say sunlight is actually black. However, in the evening and night, now I quote from his story, this blind man always has several flashlights. And whenever he went out at night, he would always take one with him. The darker it got, the longer and brighter the beam from his flashlight would become. As a result, as he was walking through the village streets in the middle of the night, people would be able to see him coming and wouldn't run into him. Furthermore, when people encountered him, he would use his flashlight to illuminate the road in front of him. And the end of this story is that when this blind man passed away, the villagers put flashlights into his coffin. So his coffin is full of flashlights and with electricity too. Yeah. So this is the famous blind man story from Lianke. I chose to introduce to you his novel, The Day the Sun Died, translated by Carlos, my panelist today, Carlos Rojas, because it won in 2016. The book was published in 2015, and the next year he won the 6th Dream of the Red Chamber Award. But as you notice, this novel, as most of Lianke's work, has been published in Taiwan instead of mainland China. It's mainly published in Taiwan, sometimes Hong Kong too. And the reason, as everybody knows, because Lianke's novels are mostly banned in mainland China. So this novel begins with, sorry, go back one page. Yeah. This novel begins with some wild birds. Carlos translate into phoenix, okay? They fly into people's minds. And then that night, the villagers or the town people become sleepwalkers. It was in August, very hot summer. And then start a nightmare of the peasants' unrest or uprising. So the entire novel is actually full of chaos and violence during their uprising. The novel actually goes through only 16 hours, less than a day. So it starts at 5 p.m. and ends at 9:30 in the next morning. Interestingly, I find that because I'm not a speedy reader, so 16 hours is just the right duration of my own reading. So I spent 16 hours in reading this story of 16 hours. So the story proceeds hourly, but then all of a sudden in the latter part, time stops flying at 6 o'clock in the morning for 40 pages. And then the sun died for 3 hours before it resumes. I try not to tell, our participants today too many details about this novel, because in case you haven't read it, you still have room to enjoy it. Okay, and then so this is the one of the cover designs of the English translation translated by Carlos, and the entire novel is told in the first-person narrative by a 14-year-old boy. And we also find that it's a metafiction, because in that Lianke himself also appears as Uncle Yan, and he expresses his anxiety of writing, his anxiety as a writer, don't know how to write more and better. So we also find images of hope and self-redemption, and the brightness in this dark fiction are the flowers in the crematorium, and the flowers dedicated to the dead. Many people die during the peasants' uprising in the novel. And at the end, there is a self-burning with corpse oil. So what happened to this self-burning, and why with corpse oil? Again, I will leave it to our readers. So literary critics always would like to compare this novel by Lianke to two classics in the world of literature. One is Albert Camus' The Prague. The other one is Jose Saramago's Brightness. So yeah, I see a chat notice maybe reminding me of not much time left. Okay, and in a bibliographical essay on Lianke, Canadian Chinese scholar Liang Laifeng, she describes Lianke's work as a kind of anti-utopian. And she suggests that Lianke is a high-profile author because of his political courage and compassion for humanity. On the right-hand side, see the image that I edited. This is a collection of criticisms on the day the sun died. Here, because I see the notice of time's coming to the end. So I would say Lianke, he once said that China in its modern and contemporary history is jumping from one utopia to another utopia and to another utopia. So we can think of in the context of what we call China Dream today. And if we reflect on from Mao's Cultural Revolution to Deng's economic reforms to Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, maybe we should consider it in the sense of the French philosopher Derrida's spectator of Marx, that is this a haunting, a hauntology that comes to what we call the China dream today. And I would like to end my presentation today with two more quotations, one from Hannah Arendt, and she actually she was inspired by Brecht, the German dramatist. She said that even in the darkest of the times, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination might well come less from theories and concepts than from uncertain, flickering, and often weak light. And lastly, this is a word actually from a title of the Swedish poet, Thomas Tranströmer. And unfortunately, I'm not able to speak the Swedish language, but I know the meaning is sing in the dark. So I see Lianke's dark fiction is actually leading us to see in the dark. And that is my brief introduction today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Choi, for the wonderful presentation. It gives us enough reason to read Yan Lianke's The Sun Died, translated by Carlos Rojas, another of our panelists today. I read Carlos' preface to the novel, which is excellent as well. And I'd like to remind the audience that you can put your question in the Q&A column, and we will select the questions to answer at the end of our presentations today. So thank you very much for coming. And our next presenter is Shirley Chang, Professor of Chinese Language and Cultural Studies at Wittenberg University. She is the author of A Subversive Voice in China, The Fictional World of Mo Yan, and she has published widely on Chinese literature, culture, and the cinema. And her talk title is The Dream, the Disease, and the Disaster, on Yan Lianke's Dream of Ding Village. So I'll hand it over to Shirley. I think you have to unmute yourself to start the presentation. We can see your PPT now, but we can't hear your voice as of now. Yeah.
Yes, I actually realized that when I talked, my video was not on.
Shirley, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, good. We can hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay. And also you can see my PPT, right?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
great. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Jonathan and Zhu Ping and the colleagues at the Oklahoma University who put together this wonderful Newman Prize Symposium. And also thank you for inviting me to speak at this symposium. The presentation is based on part of my published article of the same title. It discusses how the novel Dream of Ding Village shows concern for the biopolitical situation of the Chinese people and how it spearheads its criticism on the blood economy in central China in the 1990s and its disapproval of irrational materialistic desire that leads to an ill-practiced modernization. Through studying its mytho-realistic components, such as the unconventional narrative voice and the experimental structure, this presentation examines the characteristics of the thanatopolitics of the story and the possible practice of self-censorship by the author Yan Lianke. China has developed tremendously over the past 4.5 decades. Its recent achievements and its ambitious development strategies, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, seen as an attempt of the Chinese dominance in world affairs, have caught much attention from the rest of the world. As a result, many Chinese people believe that their country has shaken off its humiliating image as the sick man of East Asia, which was the collective anxiety of the Chinese intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, this anxiety is still troubling some Chinese who see present-day China as an unhealthy society wherein people are spiritually ill. Among them is Yan Lianke, who has published novels of disease, such as these three, 日光流年, 丁庄梦, and 寿活. These novels are about cancer sufferers, physical disabilities, and HIV-infected patients. Each of them can be thought of as a social commentary. Set in Henan province in China, Dream of Ding Village is about how the local people engage in the infamous blood economy and get infected with AIDS. In the early to mid-1990s, the provincial government promoted a policy to shake off poverty and attain prosperity, and urged poor people to make money by selling their blood. The authority called this the blood economy or plasma economy, and believed that this policy would make the people rich and the nation strong. In China, which still claims to be a socialist country, but in fact is more capitalist than many other countries that practice capitalism, this biopower of manipulating people's bodies is what Foucault calls, quote, an indispensable element in the development of capitalism, end quote. As Carlos Rojas points out, quote, residents of remote central Chinese villages are encouraged to join contemporary capitalist systems by literally commoditizing their own bodies. The result is a process wherein the individual's relationship to the economic order is fundamentally transformed as the subject's own body becomes a commodity in its own right, end quote. Ironically, the blood economy that aimed at increasing the provincial government's revenue and improving people's well-beings proved to be the main cause of a terrible outbreak. According to Dr. Gao Yaojie, China's most outspoken AIDS activist, this blood economy was a blood disaster and national calamity. Like many of Yan Lianke's novels, the structure of Dream of Ding Village is highly experimental, which is a mixture of reality and dreams of the narrator's grandfather. The Chinese version of the plague, Dream of Ding Village, is a macabre story filled with depictions of death. The story is narrated by a 12-year-old dead boy. His father, Ding Hui, is a bloodhead who collects blood from his fellow villagers and sells it to blood stations. After the outbreak of AIDS, and people in almost every household die for selling blood, the villagers revenge Ding Hui by poisoning his chicken, then his pig, and eventually his son. Ding Hui's business is one that trades death. He gains profits by collecting and reselling blood of his villagers. When more and more villagers die, the county government provides free caskets to the families of the dead. Ding Hui controls the distribution of the caskets in order to make money. Later, he starts a new business, arranging marriages, not between living people, but between the dead. He even sells the remains of his own son, the 12-year-old boy, to the dead daughter of the local leader. This way, he becomes a relative of the leader, directly connecting himself to the authority and power, which allows him to become the top predator. The dead first-person narrator, who is saddled with his own father's sin and the villagers' hatred, serves to turn the entire novel into a thanatos narrative. Having a dead tell the stories of the living, the boundary between the netherworld and the human world is erased, that the netherworld invades and eventually exercises control over the human world, well fits the death theme of the novel. On discussing politics over life, Roberto Esposito asks, quote, how is it possible that the power of life is exercised against life itself? Why does the power that functions by ensuring, protecting, and augmenting life express such a potential for death? Why does biopolitics continually threaten to be reversed into thanatos politics, end quote. In both the fictional and the realistic worlds, the HIV-infected patients contribute their own blood and even lives to the bloodheads' accumulation of wealth. Behind the bloodheads, the even bigger social apparatus, which have stronger destructive power once they are malfunctioned. May the intention of the blood-selling policy be in the name of a politics of power or in the name of the survival itself of populations that are involved, it is precisely what reinforces the tragic aporia of a death that is necessary to preserve life, of a life nourished by the deaths of others, in the words of Esposito again. The 2001 novel, Hard as Water, marked the turning point of Yan Lianke's writing style from traditional realism to one that has become more and more experimental and absurd, resulting in his novels being labeled as absurdism, magical realism, or surrealism by critics. Yan Lianke doesn't seem to believe that any of these existing labels would best represent the essence of his writing. As a result, he coins a term for his Kafkaesque writing style, like Howard said, Mytho-Realism, which, according to him, abandons external logical relation of the existing truth and explores a non-existing truth, an unseen truth, and a truth concealed by truth. By no means Mytho-Realism would reject realism, but it tries hard to create and transcend reality. It sees an internal truth and relies on an internal causality with which it reaches the interior of human society and the world. Yan Lianke delivered a speech at the Franz Kafka Prize Award ceremony titled Finding Light in China's Darkness. This is Carlos' translation again. And the literal translation of the title is the man chosen by heaven and life to fill the darkness. Obviously, he is the man. In the speech, he said, an enormous sheet of darkness gradually approached this man, who came to understand that darkness is not the mere absence of light, but rather it is life itself. Darkness is the Chinese people's fate. The absurdity and seemingly impossibility in his fiction are in fact the internal truth of reality. Perhaps only an absurd way of writing would be able to fully describe the absurd reality and express the love and hate complex of the novelist. In his own words, quote, the reality of China is so outrageous that it defies belief and renders realism inert, end quote. Indeed, the reality is so outrageous that makes a more unrealistic style necessary. While the magical realistic fiction of the post-colonial Latin America could be seen as implicit social and cultural criticism, Yan Lianke's Mytho-Realism, which according to some critics is a Chinese version of magical realism, had this complexity of being subversive yet submissive simultaneously. To take the first-person narrator and the dreams as an example, that narrator is doubtlessly an unreliable narrator whose omnipresent point of view is questionable, setting a thanatopolitical tone for the story. Together with Grandpa's dreams, this unreliable narrator also adds a layer of uncertainty to the mytho-realistic fiction. By making part of the real illusory and imaginary, the author inserts an artistic dimension to the story, creating a wider and deeper blurred space between reality and unreality, highlighting the absurdity of the blood economy and human greediness, and leaving the reader to question the viability of such an ill-practiced modernization. In the meantime, narrating the cruel reality in the form of dream by a dead narrator so as to make it seem less real might be a strategy of self-censorship or an, quote, internalization of external censorious impulses and practices, pointed out by Cai Xinjian. Parallel to the evil force represented by the bloodhead Ding Hui, the image of his father, grandpa, who eventually kills Ding Hui, is more interesting. The novelist means to make grandpa embody a sober force to counteract the shocking irrationality. From the beginning, grandpa constantly urges his son to apologize to the villagers for selling their blood and causing the disease. In the end, grandpa's act to end Ding Hui's life suggests the author's belief that evil will not prevail over the good. This can be read as a victory of morality that Ding Hui's father wishes to uphold over the father-son bond, an important Confucian family ethic. An ultimate hope is revealed at the end of the novel in the last dream of grandpa, in which he sees a woman, He sees a woman digging in the mud with the branch of a willow tree and raised a small army of tiny mud people from the soil. Soon, there were millions upon millions of tiny mud people dancing on the earth. Grandpa found himself gazing at a new and teeming plain. A new world danced before his eyes. The woman can be related to Nuwa, the legendary Chinese goddess who created human beings. At this point, an interesting discrepancy between the original and the translation plays an important role in the understanding of the ending. While the dreams are printed in bold-faced and a different font in the Chinese text, they are printed in italics in the translation. The very last one sentence paragraph, as you can see from the PowerPoint, is not bold-faced in the original Chinese text, but in the same font as the non-dream parts of the novel. This indicates the author's belief in the certainty that a brand new world will be created by the legendary Nuwa. In the translation, however, this last paragraph is also italicized, treating it as part of the dream and conveying a totally different message. The new world is but a dream, and the reality has no redemption. Readers of the English translation will feel an implication of the author's despair. Yet the more mysterious message is hidden in the original text, where the font is the same as the real part. Does it disclose the optimistic attitude of the author who now sees China as a curable sick man? Or is it yet another example of the author's strategy of self-censorship? Lianke did admit that he intentionally self-censored when he wrote Dream of Ding Village, quote, by doing the censor's work for them. This is not the book I originally wanted to write. I censored myself very rigorously. I didn't mention senior leaders. I reduced the scale. I thought my self-censorship was perfect, end quote. Indeed, instead of mentioning senior leaders, that could be seen as an allusion to actual leadership, he demonizes Ding Hui and put the blame on the bloodhead. Although Lianke calculated much to conduct self-censorship so he could get his book published, the book survived for 3 days only before it was banned. In the words of Jianxin Cai again, his, quote, strategic anticipation of censorship, his internalization of external censorious impulses and practices was ineffective. Ironically, the biopolitical environment is unsatisfactory not only for people in reality and in the fiction, but also for the fiction per se. This is my very brief presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chang, very much for your nuanced reading of Dream of Ding Village. Although the novel was censored in China, it actually was adapted into a film. It's called Love for Life in 2011.
Yes. By a Hong Kong producer.
Yeah, so good. So please check it out if you're interested in watching the adaptation. first.
I watched the film and also used the film as a teaching material in my film and fiction in modern China class too.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so again, please, for the audience, please put the question in the Q&A button, and we'll look at the questions together at the end of the presentations. Our next and the third presenter is Carlos Rojas. He is a professor from Chinese cultural studies, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies and the cinematic arts at Duke University. He is the author of 5 monographs, editor or co-editor of 7 volumes, and the translator of numerous works. So the numbers are counted by me. So please forgive me if I didn't count everything, Carlos. And he has translated at least 8 novels or novellas by Yan Lianke, including The Day Sun Died. We just talked about it, and the Years, Months, Days, Marrow, Hard Like Water, Lenin's Kisses, 3 Brothers, The Explosion Chronicles, and the 4 books. And today, his talk, the title of his talk is Yan Lianke's Reflections on Darkness. We have been hearing darkness from the first 2 presenters' talks already. So let's hear more about darkness in Yan Lianke. Carlos, please. Yeah, we can see you now.
Yeah, I'm loading my PowerPoint. Let me see. So we're good, right? You can see the PowerPoint?
Yes, it looks good.
Good. Okay, great. So I'd like to start by thanking our hosts, Jonathan and Zhu Ping, for organizing this and for inviting us to speak. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-panelists, Howard, Shirley, and Eric, and also would like to give a brief shout out to the audience who has assembled virtually. I see that we currently have well over 100 audience members, and sort of scanning the names, I see many sort of familiar names, including colleagues, friends, students, and former students. So thank you all for showing up. So I'd like to just go ahead and get started. I'll be repeating some things that Howard and Shelley mentioned, but whereas they each spoke, focused on one particular work, I'll try to give a survey of a number of, basically of Yan's oeuvre. So Yan Lianke's first full-length novel, Prison House of Emotion, from 1991, is framed by 2 betrothals. First, the work opens with a 20-year-old narrator learning that his fiancée has suddenly decided to break off their engagement because her father, the local village chief, wants her to marry the son of the deputy township mayor, who is about to be promoted to the position of mayor. Second, the novel concludes a few months later with the narrator rescuing the daughter of the local party secretary after she injures herself falling from a precipice. The narrator hopes that the young woman will be willing to marry him, that the latter young woman will be willing to marry him, but she informs him that she has recently become engaged to a county official, and she explains that after their people's commune is converted into a township and their production brigade is converted into a village, she hopes their fiancé will be appointed township mayor, which in turn may enable her father to be appointed village chief. The novel's coda then describes how the protagonist instead decides to join the army, but is initially passed over in favor of the nephews of the village's party secretary and of the director of the Public Security Bureau, both of whom failed the same fitness exam that the narrator had already passed. Only after the narrator threatens to kill himself is he finally accepted into the army. So the narrator is a 20-year-old who is trying to establish a family, find a spouse, is running up against a very complex web of local politics and political favors, eventually gives up on that and decides to join the army, and once again finds himself sort of tripped over by this web of local politics and political favorings. In addition to the intricate imbrication of personal and political considerations in early Reform era China, and we know from the fact that the conversion of brigades and communes into villages and townships that is mentioned at the end of the work occurred in 1983, so that's the time period of the novel. The Prison House of Emotion also offers an example of a self-referential gesture that will become one of the distinctive features of Yan Lianke's later writings, and that the narrator of the work is in fact named after the author, Yan Lianke, and his decision to join the army at the age of 20 mirrors the author's own decision to do so in 1978. In his more recent work, Yan mentions this sort of self-referential gesture, uses this sort of self-referential gesture to underscore the author's relationship to his work and to the socio-political environment within which he is positioned. Although the Prison House of Emotion is basically structured as a conventional narrative, it does contain several non-narrative segments that anticipate some of Yan's later, more experimental writings. For instance, after the narrator reveals near the end of the first chapter of the novel that the fiancé of the village's daughter is, quote, is actually me, Yan Lianke, end quote, the narrative immediately breaks away from that diegesis to another seemingly unrelated story. And this is a block quote. Quote, let me tell you, this is another story. In this story, our family has a house behind which lies the Baolo Mountains. In truth, however, these are not so much mountains, but rather hills. Last spring, when the grass was fresh, the trees were green, and the fragrance was thick, I went out to weed the fields, whereupon I suddenly saw a miraculous sight. A hillside was suddenly covered in thousands upon thousands of wild rabbits that were all racing down the mountain. The rabbits blanketed the earth and sky like the flocks of gray birds flying up and down the mountain. Their heads, and then there's an ellipsis of a few sentences, and then it continues. Their heads, the rabbits' heads were facing the ground as their eyes avoided the sunlight. And the ground became a vast expanse of darkness. Yipian Heian. In this suggestive passage, the narrator appears to be abruptly changing the topic of conversation to avoid the discomfort associated with the original subject, namely the fact that his fiancé, his fiancé's father has decided to pressure his fiancée to break off her engagement with him and to marry a local official. Curiously, though, embedded within this narrative digression is another act of avoidance, in the specification that all of these wild rabbits racing down the mountain have their heads cocked down in order to avoid looking up at the sunlight, so that they are instead gazing down at the expansive darkness of blackness under their feet. The description of the rabbits literally turning away from the light and staring into the darkness, in turn, offers an uncannily prophetic description of Yan's subsequent literary trajectory. Born in 1958 in rural Henan province, Yan Lianke joined the People's Liberation Army in 1978, the same year that Deng Xiaoping launched the Reform and Opening Up campaign. The following year, 1979, Yan published his first short story, a story of, I guess we call it Gastrodia Orchids, 天马的故事, about a young man attempting to join the army. Over the next 2.5 decades, Yan worked as a professional author for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and although many of his early works were relatively conventional social realist narratives, beginning in the late 1990s, he began to shift to a more experimental and metafictional style and to a focus on issues of oppression and exclusion, which is to say, he shifted to a focus onto the dark underbelly of modern China's development. In particular, the first novel from the more experimental or socially engaged phase of Yan Lianke's career is arguably his fourth novel, Streams of Time, which was published in 1978. Shelley, in her talk just now, identifies this shift in his following novel, the 2001 novel, Hard Like Water, which, by the way, is coming out this month in Britain and this summer in the US in English translation. But I would argue that actually happens a little bit earlier in his previous novel in 1998, in Streams of Time. The novel, which is narrated in a reverse chronological fashion, beginning with the protagonist's death and then proceeding backwards to his birth, focuses on a town whose residents suffer a variety of physical ailments and who invariably die before they reach the age of 40. Early on, the work reveals that a United Nations health team has determined that the town's health problems are caused by excessive amounts of fluoride in the community's water supply. And the work's plot focuses on the town's various attempts to find an alternate water supply, one which they hope might help cure the disease that plagues them. In its implication that the elevated fluoride levels are caused by industrial contamination of some sort, the work presciently anticipates the debate over China's so-called cancer villages that the journalist Deng Fei helped initiate 15 years later. So at the time that Lianke wrote the novel, the term cancer villages had not yet entered the public discourse. But this is very much, I would argue, what the novel is addressing. Yan's 2006 novel, Dream of Ding Village, which Shirley just discussed, similarly adopts an unconventional narrative structure insofar as roughly every other chapter is narrated in the voice of a young boy who is killed shortly before the novel begins, meaning that he is effectively narrating the work from beyond the grave. The novel describes a remote Henan village that had been devastated by an outbreak of HIV/AIDS driven by contaminated blood selling equipment. But unlike China's so-called cancer villages, which had not yet become a talking point at the time that Yan wrote Streams of Time, the nation's HIV/AIDS crisis had already received considerable attention by the time that Yan began writing Dream of Ding Village. He actually made several trips to a Henan village that had been impacted by the epidemic, and he drew on his observations in writing the resulting novel. As he later observes, however, he deliberately downplayed some of the more horrific aspects of what he observed in this village in an attempt to avoid problems with the censors. But as Shirley notes, as it turns out, even after this process of self-censorship, the novel was still recalled almost immediately after its initial publication. After this frustrating experience in writing Dream of Ding Village, in that he censored himself only to have the work be banned anyway, Lianke therefore resolved, when writing about a politically sensitive topic of the Great Famine 4 years later, to address the topic without consideration of how the novel might be received by the censors. The result was his 2010 novel, Dream of Ding Village, The Four Books, which is set in a 1950s labor reform camp for accused rightists, with the latter portion of the novel being set against the backdrop of the Great Famine that followed the Great Leap Forward. The novel's title alludes to the way that the work is composed of 4 interspliced texts, of which 2 are composed by a fictional character known simply as the author. One of these texts, titled Criminal Records, is a journalistic account of the illicit activities of some of the camp's other detainees, which the author has agreed to compile for the authorities in order to secure greater leniency for himself. So it's a kind of a Mephistophelian pact that he makes with the local authorities. The other text, of course, is titled Old Course. It is a literary account of many of the same events that the author began compiling in secret, hoping to use it as the basis of a novel after he's released. With this juxtaposition of 2 fictional texts, both recounting the same events, but for radically different purposes, the 4 books foregrounds the challenges of how to reconcile one's literary aspirations on one hand, and the practical exigencies of working within a state-driven censorship system on the other. In addition to Lianke's focus on social crises in fictional works like Streams of Time and Dream of Ding Village, he also frequently reflects on issues of politics and aesthetics in his non-fictional works. For instance, in 2011, shortly after completing the 4 books, Yan published a work of literary criticism titled Discovering Fiction, which Howard mentioned in his talk, in which he discusses developments in realist and neorealist fiction from the 19th century to the present, including a post-realist practice that he calls Mytho-Realism, which he suggests is a distinguishing feature of some of his own recent works. Here's a cover of Discovering Fiction. Yan opens this book by alluding to the afterword that he wrote for the 4 books, the novel, The Four Books, and the afterword is titled A Traitor to Writing, in which Lianke describes how, as he was writing the novel, The Four Books, he was sanguine about the fact that the novel had, quote, almost no chance of being published in China. He then explains that, quote, many of the deviations from, quote unquote, literary expectations that appear in the 4 books are not true cases of betrayal, but rather they are merely preliminary clues, hints of what I might write in the future. This, accordingly, is why I ultimately decided to call myself a traitor to writing, end quote. Lianke writes on, reflects on related issues in his 2014 essay collection, Silence and Rest, Chinese Literature in My Experience. That's an approximate translation. Based on a series of 12 lectures that Yan delivered at North American universities following the publication of the English translation of Lenin's Kisses in 2012, this volume addresses topics ranging from the relationship between what he calls national amnesia and literary memory to the condition of what he calls living without dignity, yet at the same time writing with honor. One of the most pointed essays in the collection, however, explicitly addresses the issue of literary censorship. Yan opens this particular essay by observing that when he travels abroad, he is frequently introduced as China's quote unquote most censored author. But he specifies that this is definitely not something that in which he takes any pride. He notes that we often celebrate banned works by famous authors like Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak, Nabokov, D.H. Lawrence, Borges, Vargas Llosa, Miller, Kundera, Rushdie, Pamuk, and Simon Kadare. But he contends that these works are not great because they are banned, but instead they are great works that happen to have been banned. He argues that there is no inherent value in having one's works banned and suggests that there are countless mediocre works that have also been censored, but which are subsequently largely forgotten. On the other hand, however, despite insisting that banned works are not necessarily good, he also notes that given the specific political realities of contemporary China, if a contemporary Chinese author never runs into problems with the state censorship apparatus, then that in itself is suspicious in its own right. Lianke reflects even more explicitly on the political ramifications of his writing in his essay titled Finding Light in China's Darkness, that he initially wrote upon his acceptance, for his acceptance speech upon winning the Franz Kafka Prize in 2014. And Howard has already mentioned this in his talk. This is a picture of Lianke receiving the Franz Kafka statuette. In the essay, Yan recalls an old blind man from his home village and describes how every morning when the sun came up, he would turn to the eastern mountains facing the rising sun and say to himself, it turns out that the sunlight is actually black, but that is good. He then describes how when the blind man went out at night, he would always take a flashlight, not to help him see, but rather to permit others to see him. Yan then suggests that as an author, he took inspiration from this blind man. Quote, from this blind man, I came up with a new form of writing that's premised on a conviction that the darker it is, the brighter it becomes. And the colder it is, the warmer it becomes. The entire significance of this writing lies in permitting people to avoid its existence. My writing, in other words, is like the blind man with the flashlight who shines his light into the darkness to help others glimpse their goal and destination. Yan then concludes that his receipt of the Kafka Prize is like the blind man receiving a lamp. Quote, because this lamp exists, that person who is fated to see only darkness can believe that in front of him there is light. Moreover, thanks to this light, people can therefore perceive the existence of darkness and consequently can more effectively ward off the same darkness and suffering. Meanwhile, that blind man can remain on the night road, and as people walk past him, he can illuminate the road in front of them, even if for just a short distance. So in the original talk that I prepared for today, I was going to conclude with a discussion of two recent novels in which he includes a metafictional gesture in which he includes a character or a narrator named after himself, and then kind of sort of looping back to the prison house of emotion that I discussed at the beginning of this talk. The first is Explosion Chronicles from 2013, and the second is The Day the Sun Died from 2015, which Howard has already discussed. But because I see that my time is effectively up, I will instead simply conclude here and hand over the reins to Eric. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rojas, for the comprehensive review of Yan Lianke's works. And I'll share an anecdote. Actually, Yan Lianke was nominated by Carlos in 2014 for the 5th Newman Prize for Chinese Literature. However, Wang Yi won that year. So our next speaker, Eric Abrahamson, actually took the mission, and he nominated Yan Lianke in 2020. And he this time the nomination was successful. So
actually, just a brief correction. Sorry, it actually wasn't Wang Yi. It was Zhu Tianwen. And this is actually the 4th time that Yan Lianke has been nominated.
Yeah, this is the 4th time Yan Lianke was nominated. So our next speaker, Eric Abrahamson, is a translator and a promoter of Chinese literature in English. He is a founder of Paper Republic, an informational platform for Chinese literature, and the editor of Past Life magazine, a journal of translated Chinese fiction and poetry. He is a recipient of translation grants from PEN and the National Endowment for the Arts, and his translations have appeared in the New Yorker, Grant, M+1, and many other venues. So the title of his talk is The Dread Earth. So I'll give the next 18 minutes to Eric.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks to all. Let me echo Carlos in thanking our hosts and my other panelists. It's been wonderful to be able to show up here and discuss Yan Lianke and his works in this such an esteemed company. I am also very pleased to be at the end of a long relay race of people trying to nominate Yan Lianke for this prize. It was just a matter of time, I think, and it's great that we've finally got him over the line. This is always a little bit awkward for me because I'm usually the only non-academic at events like this. I'm not accustomed to making academic arguments or discussing theory, and I'm usually also the only person without a PPT. So you're going to have to watch me talk, unfortunately. Most of my work, instead of theoretical dissection of literature, involves telling people why I like things and trying to talk them into liking them too. So that was originally going to be the jumping off point for my talk today, was a little bit about sort of an appreciation of parts of Yan Lianke. As I thought about it, I did actually come around to a bit of an argument. So I do have a little like a sort of a comparison that I'm hoping I can pull off. It'll sound plausible, but really the starting point for this was appreciation. And so I went back to a conversation that I had with Yan years ago now in Beijing, when we were selecting one of his novellas to be translated for Penguin, which eventually Carlos did, and eventually turned into Merrill, which then was combined with The Years, the Months, Days, came out with Grove. Really excellent stories, excellent translations, and I'm very pleased that these are readable. And I was talking to him about why I liked his writing, and I mentioned that something in it reminded me of Flannery O'Connor, the earlier US writer. And I didn't think too much more about it at the time. But when I came to start preparing this talk and sort of remembered this whole moment, I started to think, okay, what's in there? Why Flannery O'Connor? What is it about her writing and Yen's writing that caused a little chime in my mind? And the first thing that popped up in my head was the phrase "holy dread." I know dread is very, like the title of my talk sounds very pretentious. Holy dread, sort of a Coleridge reference, sounds very pretentious, but those words came into my mind when I was thinking about the two of them, and I started to dig a little bit deeper. And I want to make clear here that I'm talking about mostly Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, her earlier writing. Wise Blood's her first novel, and on the one hand, and then Yan Lianke's novellas, The Years, Months, Days, Marrow on the other, but really The Years, Months, Days. And there was something about these two writers, these two works, their writing of this era, that caused this reaction of holy dread in me. And that was what I loved, and that's why I love why both of them are two of my favorite writers out there. So Wise Blood, there's a good chance everybody's read this here, but I'll just sort of to explain the reasoning behind this, talk a little bit about it. The main character is Hazel Motes, who's a young man who's destined to be a preacher. His father was a preacher. He was raised to be a preacher. He was going to be a preacher, and he's really mad about this. He does not want to be a preacher. He wants a different destiny. He wants to be free of Jesus. He does not want to have Jesus, anything to do with Jesus. He doesn't want Jesus messing with him. He wants to go off and lead his own life. But he can't do that. He wants to leave Jesus behind. Jesus won't leave him behind. And in a wonderful phrase, one of O'Connor's great phrases, she describes how Jesus was always moving from tree to tree in the back of his mind, which I just think is a wonderful image of this external power that just won't leave you alone, won't come out and talk to you, but won't leave you alone either, sort of skittering around from tree to tree in the back of his mind. So he sets himself up as an anti-preacher. He starts the Church Without Christ. He takes the Lord's name in vain. He visits prostitutes. He does everything he can to escape his fate, essentially. The book is filled with other people with their own fates. Another character, Enoch Emery, has quote unquote wise blood, the name of the novel. This is wise blood that he inherited from his father, and his blood tells him what to do. His blood knows the truth of things. His blood has ideas for him. His blood is almost his puppet master. Another excellent phrase, an excellent description. Enoch's brain was divided into two parts. The part in communication with his blood did the figuring, but it never said anything in words. The other part of his brain is the part with the words and the phrases that then is responsible for talking to other people and kind of negotiating Enoch Emery's carrying out of his blood's desires. And so it's sort of hilarious through the story because his blood is very much like a character that controls him, and he gets a little irritated with it. He finds himself saving all his wages, which is very uncharacteristic for him. But his blood has decided that he will now save his wages. And he hopes, well, at least if I can save the wages, I'll get like a nice good suit out of it. And he is again irritated to discover that instead he's going to buy some curtains and some gilt paint. And he's waiting to find out what his blood has in store with him. So the whole story is really the story of these characters and others either resisting their fate or serving their fate. It's very much about external powers that take control of us and what we decide to do about that. And O'Connor herself called this a novel about freedom, which I guess is what that is. What do you do? What do you do with the external powers? What do you do with this fate that has taken hold of you? So it's got a very interesting feel to it. If you imagine some later existential type fiction where the protagonists are struggling to make meaning of the world, struggling to make meaning of their lives, they seem to be shouting into the void where there's nothing there. This is not O'Connor's writing. Neither is it Yan Lianke's writing. The worlds that they create are packed with meaning. Their characters are simply embedded in mystery. They're pressed right up against powers greater than themselves. Fate is not some sort of external power. It's not some, God on the mountain that we're yelling at. Fate is something that has moved in and invaded the character's blood. It has invaded their bodies. It's invaded their heads. It's reached a hand in and occupied part of what is supposed to make them human, part of what is supposed to be their selves. It's very much reached into their bodies. It's probably so they can resist this. They can do whatever they like about this. Really, their own volition has very little effect in the end on what fate has decided for them. And it's probably no spoiler to reveal that Hazel Motes dies in the end. Everyone always dies in the end. It's not a spoiler. So it might be becoming clear why this gave me a similar feeling to Yan Lianke's Days, Months, and Years in particular. So Yan's writing is very much also a story of human beings railing against a greater power. In his case, of course, the greater power is the natural world. And again, there are other greater powers in his later novels. I'm talking mostly about the novellas here. The greater power is the natural world. It's the sun, it's the drought, it's the crops, it's the mountains. There's no Christ here, there's no Jesus. But it provides absolutely the same feeling of characters who are physically embedded in a world that is packed with meaning and packed with power. In O'Connor's stories, it's that external power is reaching into the bodies of the characters, but Yen sort of reverses that direction. And he almost turns his characters inside out. He sort of pulls them apart and allows what's inside them to bleed outwards into the natural world. I don't mean that he anthropomorphizes nature, but he takes all the things that are supposed to be on the inside of a person, their senses, their emotions, their reactions to what happens, their thoughts, and he takes these elements and he one by one places them onto the aspects of the natural world. And he does this partially, this effect is partially created through synesthetic language. So the senses are cross-wired. Sound has a smell. Smell has a sound. Light has a sound. Light has weight. The earth exhales. There's all these sort of physical human movements going on in the world. It also comes about through the elder's attempt to interact with everything around him. He shouts at the sun, screams at the sun, swears at it. He tries to negotiate with the wind. He tries to negotiate with all these sort of impersonal, natural things around them. And there's this, it creates this feeling of a deep interpenetration between the individual human and the natural world. And this is an interpenetration that becomes literal in one of the last scenes of the story. But like in O'Connor, this connection between the individual and the world around them is physical. It's through the body. It's through the blood. It's through the sweat. It's through the urine. It's through the eyes. Of course, the Years, Months, Days is, like O'Connor's Wise Blood, a grand story of resistance against fate. There's the epic scene where he stands off against an entire pack of wolves through superhuman effort, keeps himself up all night, not backing down, not giving them a moment's opening to attack him and kill him and eat him. Just through sheer force of will, presenting himself as strong and indomitable. And eventually the sun comes up and he has won the battle. And he goes back to his camp only to discover that in the long time that he was away, his cornstalk has almost died. So it's a story of resistance against fate, but the elder has about as much success in his resistance against fate as Hazel Motes and Enoch Emery do in O'Connor's writing. And you can guess what happens in the end. I won't spoil that one either. So both of these are stories about attempting to wring succor and mercy out of a world that was only ever going to give us one thing, which is death. That was all the world was ever going to give us. And I don't mean to bring this up as it sounds depressing, but it isn't. Part of my love for both of these writers and both of these works of writing is that it comes off in the end as comforting to me. It's comforting to know that the powers of the world do exist, that there is a fate, there is a meaning, and that those powers see us. We have a connection to it. They may be cruel to us, they may ignore our desires, they may ultimately kill us, but there's never any doubt that they are real. And even their cruelty is a kind of comfort. And I think that that's what I was feeling when I heard the phrase holy dread in my mind. The sense of a world that may care nothing for us, but we are nonetheless a part of it. That's all I was going to say. I hope I'm within time. I'm sure I am within time. Yes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eric, for beautifully and powerfully telling us why the story, Lianke story, is so important. I actually love the Years, Months, and Days very much. An epic story about the fight between the human, old man, and the nature. So everyone should read this story, translated by Carlos Rojas again. Okay, we have finished all four presentations. Thank you all for the wonderful talks. And now we have some time for the Q&A. So I'm going to invite the presenter, the four speakers, to turn on their camera, or maybe also turn on their microphone, and then I'm going to select some questions from the Q&A part. The first one is from Deng Tianyuan. So she was trying to find out more about the notion of darkness that almost all of you talked about in your speeches. So she felt, I don't know if the speakers can see the question. So she felt like Yan Lianke's darkness has a kind of agency to capture reality of life in a way that other kind of darkness cannot. And it's very much like Nietzsche's decadence. So is there any theorization of darkness vis-a-vis decadence? So I wonder who can talk about, which one of the panelists can talk about your understanding of Yan Lianke's darkness, some kind of, from a theoretical perspective. It's a kind of hard question, right? to begin with the Q&A with a theory question.
Right, I know that in literature, we have an age or even individual writers that deal with both. But then in terms of theory, I'm still pondering on that. I'm still thinking. We know that in Western literature, for example, just 5 years ago, there was a collection of poetry published, and it's called Darkness, exactly Darkness and Decadence, by the poet Lin Jarrett. But then back to modern Chinese literature, we of course find that if you say Lu Xun represents darkness, then we still have other schools like 新感觉派, the new sensation school that can represent decadence. Or even in Yan Lianke's own work, we sometimes find in his own novels, we see both darkness and decadence. But I'm still talking about creative work, but not theory. In theory, we can easily find on either side, but not both. For example, decadence, we easily think about Bakhtin. But then I won't say Bakhtin has theorized much about darkness. Yeah, maybe Carols, I don't know. Yeah, I think Carols is still thinking. Yeah, so I'm still searching in my mind.
Can I just address this from a non-theoretical point of view? Sorry, but from a sort of literary imagery point of view. While Carlos was talking, he quoted this part from the story where the rabbit's running down the hills and looking down so as not to see the darkness. And this immediately reminded me of, again, the scene from the Years and Months Days, where Blindy the dog was left outside to look up at the sun until the dog goes blind, which is like a weird inversion of the sort of the same movement, right? It's either you're trying to avoid the darkness, or you've gone so far towards the light that you've gone blind, which is yet another kind of darkness. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain what Yen's doing there, but Years, Months, Days is so full of light, and it's not a happy light. It's a dangerous, burning, blinding, killing light. And I wonder if to him this question of light and dark is actually is more of an aesthetic question than one that is that could be sort of compared to decadence or some other sort of external idea, whether this is actually a very physical sensation for him, and that both of those things are deadly, both of those things are dangerous. That's all I got.
Just to quickly follow up on that and to clarify, the point from Prison House of Emotion is not that the rabbits were looking down to avoid looking at the darkness. They're looking down to avoid looking at the sun. They're looking down at the darkness, right? And so that's parallel with the Years, Months, and Days, and it's actually parallel to his famous allegory of the blind man that he discusses in the Franz Kafka Prize acceptance speech many years later, 2.5 decades later, where the blind man, the interesting twist about that allegory is the blind man is carrying a flashlight, not for himself to see, but for others to see. But then it gives the additional specification that what is it helping the others to see? It's not helping them to see what is there, but rather it's helping them to see the darkness, right? So it's illuminating the darkness in order to reveal the darkness, which I think is kind of a really interesting twist. I personally don't associate his discussion of darkness with decadence, at least not in a kind of a European aesthetic sense, because that for me carries much more specific connotations, but rather for me it's the simple the underbelly, the dark, the part of Chinese society that falls out of view, the sort of the pain, suffering, sort of radical sort of oppressiveness, and that he's trying to reveal that. So he doesn't want to remove the darkness. He wants to make people aware of this facet of modern contemporary Chinese society.
Thank you very much. Shirley, do you want to say something or add?
Not much, but I just wanted to repeat, what I said in my presentation. For Lianke, darkness is not the mere absence of light. Darkness is the entire fate of Chinese people. So yeah, I agree that it's not. I don't associate it with like decadence either. It's kind of like darkness is the like this the question says, the darkness is the kind of agency to capture, Chinese people's fate, Chinese people's life.
Yeah, I agree. Like Howard mentioned in the presentation, the ghosts, right? In the dark world, actually, it's alive, right? There are a lot of ghosts roaming around, and Yan Lianke likes to use ghost narratives as if some darkness has its own agency. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to shift to an easy question. Howard, do you want to still address something on this same topic?
Yes,
Okay,
very quick. I want to respond to Eric's comment, which I totally agree. A couple of years ago, at a conference, the May 4th movement conference at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, when I was also presenting Yan Lianke, I mentioned that it's not just the darkness that Yan Lianke was writing about. I'm typing a scientific term here in the chat because I can put it in the Q&A box. That is a kind of a solar photothermia. The kind of the brightness not caused by darkness, but caused by brightness. It's just like when you're looking at the snow, when the snow all white, it's so bright, then you actually suffer. It's a kind of illness too. If you look at it for too long, that is the color of the China dream today. The China dream today is not dark. It's the solar photothermia. Yeah. So, but Zhu Ping, please help me if you can post this scientific term on the Q&A box. Yeah, that's what I want to respond to Eric. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, just send it to us. Okay, so next one is an easy question. It's from a high school teacher, and the question is, what are some suitable books to be assigned to high school students to read? Of course, Yan Lianke's works. Carlos?
Yeah, I was going to reply to this privately or in the chat. Actually, I'm doing an event next week with a high school, a rural high school in Wisconsin, that they're teaching Dream of Ding Village in a program that's supported by the University of Wisconsin. It's for an AP class. And so I found that interesting. So I think that, and I do think that that's a good choice. Dream of Ding Village presents a perspective on the HIV/AIDS pandemic that will resonate with students, but is a very different facet of the pandemic than one that students will be familiar with from an American or European perspective. And the other thing I would say is echoing Eric's comments. I think some of his novellas, including The Years, Months, Days, and Marrow, which is the two works that Eric was focusing on, I think would lend themselves very nicely to being taught to high school students.
Thank you, Carlos. And so that also answered one of the questions in the Q&A, which was asking about the title of the book Eric talked about. It's Years, Months, Days. Yes. Okay, so this question is from Song Weijie. Hi, Weijie. And it's for Howard and Carlos. Could you elaborate more on Yan Lianke's Mytho-Realism? How it would provide new and creative ways to confront, display, and illuminate the looming darkness from Chinese rural areas to the urban milieu? For Howard and Carlos.
I know that Weijie, hi Weijie. I know that he's working on the urban. Actually, Song Weijie is an expert on the Chinese urban, including like particularly Beijing, right? Yes, Yannick mostly is writing from the rural, you're right, including his most recent collection of prose essays, Tamen. Yeah, this Tamen is actually the Tamen from the Chinese rural. So your question is that we provide new and creative ways to confront, display, and illuminate the living darks from Chinese. I'm not sure if you are talking about from or to. You mean illuminating from the rural to the urban or crossing both areas? For me, Yannick's writing is more on the rural side than the urban side, but Carlos will be a better expert to answer, maybe respond to Weijie's question.
Sure. So I mean, I'm not sure exactly where Weijie is coming from because he's very familiar with the concept and the book as well. But just for our general audience, so the concept of mytho-realism is one that Yannick positions within this larger trajectory of realist and neo-realist writings. He starts with In Discovering Fiction, which is translating will be forthcoming probably next year. He begins by looking at sort of 19th century European realism, then moves to early 20th century modernism, mid 20th century magical realism. And he argues that mytho-realism borrows from, but diverges from each of these earlier approaches or models of realism. One of the things that I think he really takes inspiration from and is I think one of the driving impulses behind what he's trying to accomplish through his mytho-realist writings, or what he calls his mytho-realist writings, is this sense that you look at contemporary reality, and he's referencing Chinese reality, but I think this is true elsewhere as well. And you almost feel that reality is almost more fanciful, more far-fetched, harder to believe than something that would come out of a fictional work, right? So this inversion of fiction and reality, where fiction seems more real and reality seems more far-fetched, and we can easily think of countless examples of this kind of phenomenon. And so he's trying to give another turn of the screw and to take that essentially fictionalized reality or perception of reality as itself fictionalized and use it as a starting point for writing fiction in its own right. So I think that this offers a lot of potential for reflecting on some of the apparent absurdities of urban, rural, suburban, what have you, reality in China and elsewhere.
Thank you, Carlos. So next, I'll invite my colleague Jonathan to also be a host and co-host and ask the next question. Jonathan, go ahead.
Our next question is from one of my very first teachers, Yue Laoshi, Yue Mingbao, from UH. So it goes like this. So interesting point just made by Carlos Riyan's own thoughts about PRC censorship and the suspicion, not to say subtle resentment perhaps, that people in the West might only be interested in his work because he always is cited as the most censored writer in PRC. Isn't there, though, a tinge of truth of what Yan is saying? And doesn't this raise an important question about the two dominant modes of thinking about the relationship between aesthetics and politics, i.e., under what conditions and motives we tend to aestheticize politics or politicize aesthetics, something that Walter Benjamin, mentioned by Howard Choi in his PPT, also theorized in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So this, I think, could go to any panelist, although, Carlos, you are, of course, referenced in it.
Okay, I'll take a first shot at this. I think that this is a great question. And I think that it can be addressed from two different perspectives, right? I mean, I think it's asking both about politics of reception, but then also about approaches to literary production, right? From the perspective of reception, I think it's certainly true that there is a certain cachet abroad in the US and elsewhere. If we hear that something has been censored, particularly in a Chinese context, we kind of want to know why. You know, that makes it sound more interesting, right? There's a possibility that it'll be something polemical or provocative or risque, and that's been, I think, certainly a selling point for a number of authors, including some of Lianke's recent works, but also others. But I think that Lianke's point here is that the simple act of being censored is not in itself any guarantee of literary quality, which I think is a self-evident truth. I think that the flip side of the question that is, I think, is implicit in the question is how this speaks to his own approach to writing. And I've had numerous discussions with him, and I feel that, I mean, he talks about how the 4 books, he decided up front that he was not going to try to have it be accepted. But a lot of his other recent works, he actually has hoped that they would be able to be to make it through the censorship process, and has been deeply disappointed that they haven't been released, or that many of them haven't. Some of them have, but that many of them have not been released. And because he feels that his primary interlocutors, primary audience, his primary readership are his compatriots, right? Are his fellow Chinese. And so he doesn't, I think he's trying to work within the system. The final point that I wanted to make, which is relevant to this question, is we talk about the censorship apparatus. I think that it's important to recognize, and this is something that he stresses, that increasingly it's not so much a question of official censorship, but rather increasingly it's an operation of what he calls soft censorship, where books are not even going to the censors. A lot of his recent novels are never even being read by the censors, but rather it's publishing houses, editors, journals that are preemptively deciding that something looks controversial and deciding not to accept it based on what they anticipate will be the censor's response. And so you basically have this internalization of the censorship apparatus into the whole publishing mechanism, the whole publishing industry, which he argues is even a more pervasive and a more pernicious phenomenon than state-driven top-down censorship in the first place.
Thank you, Carlos, for the answer. And our next question is from Miriam Gross. She's my colleague from the International Area Studies, actually. So her question is about the dream of Ding Village. She finds that there is an interesting inversion of capitalist modernity and the traditional socialist communalism. So can you, I think mainly for Shirley, who talked about Dream of Ding Village, can you comment on his various ideas of modernity and the tradition across Lianke's work? So this actually opens for more speakers to answer this question.
Yeah, I also read this question, but I am not very clear about the question. You know, the interesting inversion of capitalist modernity is the more traditional and socialist communalism. Is it only about Dream of Ding Village? But it looks like the question is also for Lianke's other works too.
Yeah, you can talk about, maybe you can talk about Lianke's views about tradition and modernity generally.
Tradition and modernity. Well, this is a pretty big question, I would say. Yeah, so in general, well, the capitalist modernity, it looks like I said, in Dream of Ding Village is kind of like, I read Lianke's like criticism on the like pretty ill practiced modernity or modernization, and also in his like Lian's Kisses and The Day the Sun Died. And you can also see this like more, it's not saying that he condemned the capitalist modernity, but it's saying that what I saw is that he is criticizing the people in China's practice or immature or malfunction of this modernity.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not sure about, other panelists, what you think about this.
Carlos?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think the one of the interesting things about Dream of Ding Village is that it suggests that part of the crisis, and historically this is true, derives from rural China being very eager to join this economic development that had already sort of enveloped the cities during this period in the 80s and the 1990s, right? That you have this rapid economic development in the cities. The rural areas are being were being left behind, and they were wanting to find ways of generating income that would allow them to improve their standard of living. And the phenomenon of widespread blood selling was an attempt to literally sort of sell their own bodies in order to make a profit. What's interesting about the end of the novel, and I know that some of my panelists, when it deferred from revealing spoilers, but I'll talk about the end of the novel very briefly, is that it ends on this apocalyptic note of where basically virtually the entire village is dead. But then there's this sort of semi-mythical moment where it suggests the possibility that from death, from devastation, there might be the possibility of rebirth. And I think that that's where he's perhaps trying to find something generative, something positive within this sort of rural space that might be an antipode to the modernism associated with sort of the urban centers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carlos. And the next question is about translation. We haven't had a translation question yet. So this is from Shen Chunli. And she noticed that in the translation of 4 books, the title is not capitalized. And so she was asking whether this was a deliberate choice by the translator. And I'd like to use my privilege as the moderator to add one more question. So Carlos, you have been translating Yan Lianke's works. We all know that some Chinese writers are very protective of their works, right? For example, Mo Yan, when he handed his work to a Chinese publisher, he would say, you can't change a single word. However, when he handed his works to Howard Goldblatt, he would say, do whatever you want. I can't read English anyway, right? So I wonder, what is your work relationship with Yan Lianke like? Do you have freedom to edit, his work to fit the English market?
Yeah, thanks for these questions. Just very briefly. So with respect to the 4 books cover, and I saw this question on the chat line, and so a quick sort of clarification here. So I think that what the question is referring to the cover of the British edition, where the V is in lowercase and then 4 books is in capital. In the cover of the American edition, it's all caps. I mean, every letter in the title is capitalized. And then just, book covers is something that even the author, but particularly the translator, has relatively little input into. In my experience, the American editors usually show me a copy of the cover before sending it to press and ask me for input. But often the decision's already been made, but I can give some input. I never see the British cover. Even though it's my translation, but it's just a different it's a different publishing house and it's a different system. And so I actually hadn't, I usually don't see that until much later. Why they made that decision, I think it's just it's just a compositional decision, and it's definitely not something, it was not my call, and not something I was even aware of until after the fact. And to respond to Ping's question, there are two things to be observed here. One is that the literary publication industry in China is quite different from that in the US, where in the US, authors writing, submitting sort of original manuscripts, often, usually particularly if it's a reputable press, will have an extensive relationship with the editors, right? There's an extensive sort of back and forth usually with the editor, giving sort of really concrete suggestions. And for the most part, that doesn't happen in China. In China, the author submits a copy-ready version of the text. They might correct it for obvious typos or whatever, but it's a very different relationship with the editors. And so in terms of my translations, I try to be much more faithful to the original than some of Howard's early translations, where he does make some adjustments to the structure. I try not to do that, but in the translation process, things do come up. Sometimes there's some continuity issues that I notice. Sometimes there are continuity issues that are noticed by my editor or by my copy editor. And in those cases, sometimes I'm able to fix them myself. Sometimes I kick them back to Lianke, and I say, look, the copy editor was reading this and noticed, just to cite one example, like there's a passage in one of his novels about how there's this imperial tombs under these evergreen trees, and how verdant the ground was beneath the evergreen trees. And then the editor wrote back and said, but look, evergreen trees, the pine needles are very acidic, and everyone knows that they make the soil very acidic, and it's very difficult for any plants to grow beneath these sorts of evergreens. And so the description just doesn't make sense in botanical terms. And I kicked this point back to Lianke, and he said, oh, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. But in terms of Chinese symbolism, they really have to be evergreens growing above this imperial tomb. So we can't change that. So we came up with some sort of compromise. But there is a kind of very interesting back and forth that often brings in the editors and the copy editors that make really interesting contributions to the work.
Thank you very much for the answer. So with this, we have to come to the end to today's presentations. Thank you for the wonderful night. And I'd like to give the last couple of minutes to Jonathan, the host. Jonathan.
Thank you, Ping. Thank you, Howard and Shirley, Carlos and Eric. This was wonderful, and of course we still have well over 80 people here right now at the very end, which goes to say we could no doubt go for another half an hour or longer. This of course is because we all love Lianke's work, but also because of all of you and how you illuminate it. So thank you for that. And Carlos, I can't help but say I really enjoyed that last one, and we'll be talking to you soon about your archive. Because this is precisely the kind of details that I think are really interesting for us who specialize in translation studies. So thanks for that. So tomorrow, I wanted to remind everyone that this is one of two events. Tomorrow evening, the celebration of the award will take place, but it actually already took place at Renmin University in person last week. So not only will Lianke be there tomorrow live to virtually receive his award, but we'll also get to play the videos from the actual in-person award ceremony. So we'll get to hear his acceptance speech translated by Eric Abrahamson, as well as Eric's own nomination speech that will introduce him. So I really hope everyone will come and participate in that event as well. So as we close, again, thank you all for coming, and I hope that all of you will come to the University of Oklahoma physically soon. And until then, we'll see one another virtually and in the pages of our shared books. So thanks again for everyone, and good night. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for your
Thank you very much. Good night.
Yeah. Bye.